Hello all you processing users. My name is John Park and I'm from the University of Oregon. Today we're going to be talking about using sound in processing. Now this is a pretty good, straightforward topic to explore. There are usually two main ways to work with sound in processing using libraries. Today we're going to be using the Minim library. For those of you who are using Processing 3.0, you realize, or you might realize, there is a new sound library called Sound, but for some Windows users it's causing some issues, and so I want to make sure that we use a system that that everyone has access to. So if you don't have Minim installed, you can go in Processing, go to the Sketch drop-down, choose Import Library, and just say Add Library. When the Libraries Manager pops up, we can type in the word Minim, M-I-N-I-M, and you should be able to see it here. If it's installed already, you have a green checkbox, you're good to go. If not, you can just click on the Install button at the bottom right, and that will initiate this library or third-party sort of package of code to load up. Now, a couple quick notes. It's really important that you restart processing after Minim is done. The reason why is that's what really kind of can load in all of the library files and specifically examples that we'll need. Today we're going to be working from one of the example files. So if you go to File and Examples, a little floating window should pop up. And by the way, this is a fantastic place to learn all sorts of new things in processing, new coding concepts, etc. But third-party sound libraries, such as Minim, will show up under Contributed Libraries. And here we have a drop-down for Minim. Okay, now, we're going to start, if we just go to the basics here, here are just some sort of topics that you might need to deal with in sound. Play a file, that sounds like a good starting point. So let's go ahead and open this sketch up. Alright, so a couple notes, and this might be potentially boring stuff, but we just need to understand how the syntax works in this whole thing. First of all, we have a couple of, first of all, an import. This will allow information from that library to load in. We have Minim down here, Minim, this is the class of Minim loading in. And we have this thing called Audio Player. Okay, so in this Play a File sketch, we just kind of look at what's going on here. Both of these lines will always be the same here. But where we have audio player, okay, so this is the name of the kind of the instance or the copy of this player that we're making. So this thing called player could be called whatever you want, right? This could be called, you know, sound one, etc. We'll leave it at player for now, which is just fine. But just so you know, that's up to you. Now, after, just like if you've ever worked with loading in images and processing, with sound it's very similar. The audio player will just kind of be a file that it's going to be loading into its memory, essentially. So when we say player here, the same name that you give this in the void setup, we're then going to be loading in the sound file. So they're loading in an MP3 file here, which totally works, as does an AIF file or a WAV file. All three of those should work. So within the sketch, they're loading it in here. Now we have this thing called player, which is referring to a certain sound file that's located in your processing sketch window or folder. And then the void draw here, it's actually going to be just visualizing a couple things. For first-time users, this gets a little bit complicated. You don't need to worry about that. You actually don't need any of that stuff to play the sound file. If we come down to the player area here, they're essentially saying when you hit a keyboard key, this thing will play. So let's go ahead and try this. Okay, so it says hit any key to start playback. I'll hit the space bar. Okay. Hit the space bar again, and it actually pauses, is what it's doing. So the main thing we really need to know is, well, how do we get this thing to play, and how do we get it to stop, right? So assuming that we've called our sound player here, then really what we need is to refer to it again and say, we either want to say play if we want for it to only play once. We could say .loop if we want it to perpetually play. When it's done at the end of the track, it will then restart it again. We have a couple other options that I want to make sure you know about. We have .rewind, which will bring the playhead of that player back to 0 seconds, so to start it all over again. A little bit later, we'll talk about trigger, which is kind of a different technique. Trigger won't work with our current setup, but it's good to know that it's there. And we already looked at .pause as a way to stop the file from playing at any given time. So that is the main setup. Now let's say I want to modify this play a file example. I'm going to really quickly do a file save as. I'm just going to save this down to my desktop, and I'll call it park example. Okay, so that made a new folder on my desktop called park example. Now, first question some people have is, well, how do I get sounds into my sketch? Okay, so just like when you're working with images, a really quick and easy way to get sounds working in your sketch is to simply drag them into this folder. So let's see, I'm going to go over and grab, just see, okay, so for example, here we go. Here is a sound file called bass1.wave. If I hit spacebar, just sounds like a bass. So if I want to get that file into my processing sketch, watch this. We'll just drag it right from that window. Whether you're in Windows or in OS X, doesn't matter. We can drop it right in. And down at the little gray bar, it says one file added to the sketch. Really nice feature that the creators of processing put in here, just to drag and drop stuff. I'm going to go ahead and drag a couple more files. And I just have this huge bank of files. I'm going to drag all 12 of my bass files. Now what these really are an acoustic bass that's playing all the way up in a scale. To make sure this works, now that I've added my, my sound files into the sketch, instead of loading in groove.mp3, I'm going to say, well, let's load in bass4.wave, because that's just what my sound file was called. I'll run that. If I hit any key, plays it once, stops, I'll hit it again, and it plays. Okay, so it is loading in those other files. Now, another thing that a lot of students or learners might want to do is, how do I trigger certain sounds in certain scenarios? Okay, so let's just get into that. That's going to be the main thing I want to get into here. In order to get this to work, I'm going to essentially forget this happening on a void key pressed. I'm going to just select all of that and delete that out of this example. And you know what? Let's just really strip this down. Let's say right now I don't even want to have anything in the void draw. I'm just going to delete everything out of the void draw and make it super sparse. Okay, so I've got a void draw. Very good. Now let me go ahead and add in a background. I'll make this a white background. And I'm going to draw a rectangle that is, let's draw it at 25 pixels over, 25 pixels down, and I'll make this a 50 by 50 pixel rectangle. So if I run that, nothing now will actually play my sound, but there I have that guy. And I'll make this rectangle red by doing the fill 25500. And good, so there's one rectangle. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, and I'm going to copy and paste these two lines. And let's make another rectangle that's, instead of being at 2525, let's make this at 125 by 25. So I'll shift it over to the right. And I'm going to change its fill color to be all blue. Okay, so red, green, blue. So 255 is the blue. And let's see how that looks. Okay, so there I've got two. Now let's say that I want this to play one note if I click on the red and one note if I click on the blue. That seems pretty much like a good idea. So in order to do that, let's just have two different players. One player for one of the bass sounds, one for the other. So I'm going to leave in these top two lines. They're fine as is, but where it says audio player player, let me copy that, paste it in, and I'm going to call this bass 1 and bass 2. Okay, this will always be audio player with capitals. So base 1 and base 2. Now down here in the void setup, this is where we load in the file. Instead of this being called player now, I'm going to call that base 1. And let's load in one of my base samples. So there we go. Now I also have a base 2, so I can copy and paste this same line. If you're on a PC, it's Control-C, Control-V to copy and then paste. On Mac, it's a Command-C and Command-V. And I'll say base 2, and let's load in base sound number 8. A little bit higher up in the scale. Alright, so now from now on below here, I can refer to these as base 1 and base 2. Now, in the void draw, or in its own function, we want to refer to triggering off base 1 or base 2. So let's do that down here. Below the void draw, let's have this happen on a mouse click. So I can say void mouse pressed. Okay, and when I click on this void mouse pressed, just to make sure this works at all, I could say base 1 dot play. Okay, so that'll only be one of the sounds. If I run that, let's see, it should happen if I click anywhere. Okay, if I click a second time, nothing happens, and in fact, after the sample is done, nothing is rewinding this. So this gets me into some trouble. It's like a one-time use thing, right? So what if I say base 1 dot rewind? So regardless of where it's at, whether you've played it before or not, this will send it to the playhead to 0 and then play the sound. Let's try that. Every time I click, same sample is loading up and then playing. So when it overlaps, it doesn't sound good, but there's a good start. So this is going to be important if we're going to use .play, is to have this .rewind hanging out with it. Now we only want it to play if we click on one box and play a different sound if we click on another. So let's do some if statements here. Okay, so we're going to say if, and think about where our mouse is. If the first box starts at 25, 25, and it's 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels tall, then we can really play with that. And we can say if mouse X is larger than 25 and mouse X is less than 25 plus the box's width, which is 50, so 25 and 50 is 75. So as long as mouse X is less than 75, and by the way, these double and symbols will say if this condition's true and if this condition's true, then make something happen. So we're actually going to look for 4 conditions. If your mouse is right of one area, if it's left of another area, if it's above one area, and if it's below another area. So if we're going to do the above and belows, here we have mouse Y. We want to make sure if it's larger than 25, and if mouse Y is less than 75 pixels. Okay, so that's for all 4 of those conditions. If that statement is true, if we've clicked between all of those 4 areas here, which makes up kind of an invisible bounding box, if you will, then the stuff between the 2 curly brackets, whoa, oh heck no. Okay, the stuff between these 2 curly brackets is what fires off. So what we'll be firing off is this base 1 sound. Okay, so let me go ahead and run that. If I click anywhere out here, no dice. If I click in the red box, yes dice. Outside, no good. Okay, excellent. So we want to do the exact same thing now, but load it in for the second file. I'm a true proponent of saving a lot of time whenever possible. So look, we have this entire if statement here that we've already written. Let's grab just the if statement. I'm going to copy that with Command-C. I'll drop down a couple lines, paste it in. Now, what's going to need to change? First of all, the sound file itself. Forget sound 1. Let's have the second sound file load in. The other thing that's going to change is the second rectangle is being drawn at 125 pixels over instead of 25 pixels over. So when we look at these values, we want to say if our mouse X is larger than 125 and less than 175. In this case, my rectangle in the Y position is exactly the same as it is up here with the other rectangle. So I can leave these other things as is. So let's just do that and hit play. And here, sound 1, sound 2. Sound 1, sound 2. Anywhere else, no dice. Okay, so there we have it. We've got two different sounds triggering off concurrently. If you wanted to mix these kind of event or trigger based sounds with an ambient soundtrack that was looping in the background, you certainly could loop a sound and just have it loop from the void setup. So that might sound a little bit weird. Let's try it out here. Let's say I copy my audio player, and I'm going to call this ambient. And in my void setup now, I'll copy one of these lines, paste it in, but I'm going to say ambient is the thing that I'm going to be working with. Alright, so what is it going to be loading in? Let's load in base1.wave. Now, if I want this to be, if this is say like a 2-minute soundtrack that will just perpetually loop in the background ever so quietly, I could right here, right in the void setup say ambient, as soon as I learn how to spell anything, ambient.loop, semicolon. That's all it needs just to play that file right away and start looping it. In this case, it's going to sound kind of funny because it's going to be a single low bass note, but let's try it. Okay, I'm not clicking on anything. There it's looping, and I can do this. All right, there we go. So that could be of use for some of you if that's what you want to do. Now, let's see, is there anything else we want to do? For this tutorial, the last thing I want to get into is if I were to run this without the ambient background portion, sounds like this. If I click on this a bunch of times, you might hear a kind of ugly, clicking, sort of error-like sound. Okay. If you want to fix that problem, I suggest you go to File and Examples, and under the exact same place where we got this example, under Basics, instead of Play a File, check out Trigger a Sample. Now the Trigger a Sample file that has one subtle change to it. Instead of saying .play, it's saying .trigger, and it's doing it with keyboard keys. So for example, I'll run this. Essentially, if I hit the S key, it does a snare. If I hit the K key, it triggers the kick drum. But if I do these really fast, it's essentially separating each playing of a sound into its own, what it calls its own thread, or its own kind of process. So the only different thing about setting this up is at the very top, when we refer to this as where we had audio player, they're calling this audio sample instead. Okay, everything else in load's the same. Audio sample down here, it says load sample instead of load file. So there's one change there. But after that, then we are allowed to call this a trigger. So let's see if we can do that in our file. If we were to change our two bases from audio player to audio sample, okay, audio sample, instead of loading a file, we say load sample. This is going to tell processing to handle this sound file a little bit differently. And let's see. Okay, that's good. In their example, when they loaded in the sample too, they were specific about after the name of the file to put a comma and put in the buffer size. So if we do the same thing and we put comma, a buffer is going to be kind of like the resolution of this file. The lower the number, the kind of lower the quality, but the faster it will play back. So I'll set those to 512. It's totally fine. And the only difference is down here, instead of rewinding, we don't need rewinds anymore. And we can say .trigger. Okay, now let's run this. And now when I click, it solved that little terrible clicking noise sound button problem. All right. So that's an option. It's not necessary, but if you really have repeating sounds, you probably want to know about trigger. Okay, so that's the basic starting point for playing and working with sounds in Processing's Minim library. All right, everyone. Good luck with the sound examples. I hope it goes well. And yeah, thanks for using Processing. Bye bye.